So this slide is an illustration of cell delays from an actual standard cell library. And I picked a 2-input NOR gate from the library. And I specified an input transition time of 80 picoseconds. That means you just imagine that one of those inputs is tied to 0 and the other input is transitioning, right? It is important that the non-transitioning input is at 0, because if it was at 1, then obviously this NOR gate output will not switch. So so just imagine that one input is at 0 and the other input is transitioning, and the transition time of the transitioning input is 80 picoseconds. Okay, and the output capacitance I have specified as 80 femtofarads. So we have very specific conditions here. Output is 80 femtofarads, output load cap, input transition time is 80 picosecond, and we're going to look at what the delays for this cell are in the standard cell library. So the table on the left is a delay from A to output. So you have to imagine that B is at 0, A is transitioning, and the table on the left tells us what the delays are from A to Y. Okay, Y is the output. When the output capacitance is 80 femtofarads and A is transitioning with 80 picoseconds. And what you see here is in this library there are multiple 2-input NOR gates with different drive strengths. So how many are there? There's XL, X1, X2, X4, X6, X8. Right? So 6 different drive strengths. XL represents low drive strength. Then there's X1, X2. That 1, 2 is just a nomenclature. It doesn't necessarily mean anything very specific other than the relative drive strength. Okay. And you can see in this case that we have 2 different delays for rise and fall from A to Y, and the difference is quite significant. So if I look at an X1 drive strength, when A is transitioning, if A is rising, if the output is rising, okay, when the output is rising, the delay from A to Y is 0.8 nanoseconds, and if the output is falling, then the delay from A to Y is 0.4 nanoseconds. So it's a big difference. So this is not a very well-designed cell in the standard cell library. In general, we prefer not to have such drastic differences in delays between rise and fall, but there will always be some difference. And in this case, the difference is quite significant. And basically, this cell is optimized for the fall transition. So the NMOS transistors in this gate are faster than the PMOS transistors because the rise delay is much higher. Okay. So on the left-hand side, you have a table for A to Y delays. On the right-hand side, you have the table for B to Y delays. So you have to assume that A is at 0 and B is transitioning. Then what are the delays from input to output? And again, different drive strengths. You can see that the delays decrease in both tables. The delays decrease very significantly as the drive strength increases. Right? So it goes, for example, for the rise delay. If you take an X1, it is about 0.7. It's 0.795 nanoseconds in the table on the right, and it falls to 0.33 nanoseconds. So it's almost more than 0.4 nanosecond decrease in delay from input to output as the drive strength increases. Okay, and you can see that the rise and fall delays are different, and the delays from A to Y are different from the delays from than delays from B to Y. Okay. Very important to appreciate that there's a lot of complexity in cell delays, and there are a lot of dependencies. Not only is there a dependency on PVT, there's a dependency on load cap, on input transition time, on the type of transition with this rise or fall, and the delays are different from different input pins to the same output. Okay. Here are some examples of some interesting cells that you would typically see in a standard cell library. Like I said, there will be hundreds, if not 1,000, different standard cells, different logic gates in a standard cell library. Incidentally, standard cell is just another, you can think of it as another term for logic gate. And so I may use those terms interchangeably. And here are some examples of the kinds of logic gates or standard cells you would see in typical libraries. And I've just picked some examples of some more interesting or slightly more complex gates. So one very common kind of gate that you will see in a standard cell library is what is known as an AND or invert gate, AOI. That's an AOI function. And there are different types of AND or invert gates. The ones I've shown two different types here. I've shown you a 4-input AOI gate, okay, on the left, and then a 3-input AOI gate. And an AOI gate is very obvious. The inputs go through AND, and then the outputs of the ANDs are OR, and then the output of the OR is inverted. Right? So that's an AOI. So it's basically an AND gate with a NOR gate. And you can see two different AOI functions. Similarly, you will have an OAI function, OR AND invert. It can be 4-input. There can even be 5-input OAI functions or AOI functions. And then, so I've shown examples of a 4-input OAI and a 3-input OAI. Okay. These are some examples of gates you will actually see in standard cell libraries, combination gates. And again, sequential gates, like I said, they can have D flip-flops with various or different flavors, including multi-bit D flip-flops. So in a multi-bit D flip-flop, it's like combining two flip-flops into a single standard cell. So it has two D inputs, two Q outputs, and that independent inputs and independent outputs, but they are in the same logic, sharing the same clock. Okay. So usually a 2-input multi-bit flip-flop or a 2-bit flip-flop will be the same logically as two 1-bit flip-flops, except it'll take less area. Okay. And area is very, very important factor in designing ASICs.